Welcome to the Sisters in Crime Writers Podcast. Everyone has a unique writing journey, so join us for conversations about those journeys from the writers themselves. It's Julie Henriques, Executive Director of Sisters in Crime, and I am really thrilled to welcome Naomi Hirahara to the podcast today. Naomi is an Edgar Award-winning author of multiple traditional mystery series and noir short stories. Her Mas Arai mysteries feature a Los Angeles gardener and Hiroshima survivor who solves crimes. The Japanese translation of her seventh and final Mas Arai mystery, Hiroshima Boy, is nominated for 2 awards in Japan. Her first historical mystery is Clark and Division, which follows a Japanese-American family's move to Chicago in 1944 after being released from a California wartime detention center. The book recently won a Mary Higgins Clark Mystery Award and a Lefty Historical Mystery Award. A former journalist with the Rafu Shimpo newspaper, Naomi has also written numerous nonfiction history books and curated exhibitions. She's also written a middle grade novel, 1001 Cranes. Welcome to the podcast, Naomi.
Thank you for having me, Julie.
Oh, I can't wait to have this conversation. Let's start where I normally start in these conversations and talk about, when you thought to yourself, I want to write a novel.
My story is very similar to many others in that I was a voracious reader. My mother's from Japan. My dad was born here but raised in Japan. So I went to the library to learn about the outside world and to interpret that actually for my parents. I'm the firstborn. And so I wanted to write stories as well. And my first story, what I would do in elementary school is, those spelling words, instead of just writing a sentence, I try to write a whole story. And I got some positive affirmation from some elementary school teachers, and that kind of started the ball rolling. And interesting enough, I was really drawn to stories of the American South, even though I'd never been there. But I think there were a lot of books at that time that was set there, some historicals. And I think also the fact that many of these books had Southern dialect in them. It was like non-standard English. It was something I was familiar with, maybe not that particular dialect, but this play on words, this kind of interpretation of like the oral language. So I began writing stories with Southern characters, and I even have some of these books that I made on 3x5 cards with different, like a family from the South, and each little kid had their own way of writing. And, it's kind of interesting looking back, because I think even as an adult, like as a golden girl that I am, what I was attempting to do when I was, 10, 11, 12 years old is kind of similar. But I think in terms of really thinking, and I attempted to write novels, in those big stretches of summer. Back then, it wasn't like we were so overscheduled. We didn't have a lot of classes. Right. We just had this, 2 months to do anything. And I would just sit and try to write a novel. But I think it became more serious, probably, in high school, I thought about it. In college, I thought about it. And when I graduated from college and I studied in Japan for a year, I was thinking, I was an international relations major. And, what am I going to do with that kind of, bachelor's degree? A lot of times people go off to become lawyers, and that's something I considered. The only problem is I don't like conflict. So that's probably not a good profession for me. And it was actually in Japan where the program I was in, we had to do a presentation at the end. And I decided to write a short story in Japanese. So, and that really kind of hooked me, like that's really my passion. So when I came back to the States, I kind of embarked, on writing, and with a dream someday that I would write a novel.
And did you take writing classes or courses, or did you, how did you develop your craft?
In college, it was really interesting. I went to Stanford, and David Henry Wong, the playwright, I know you have a playwriting background. He had attended there. He's a little bit older than me, but he had established a Asian American Theater Project. And so actually I started if you see me in person, I'm, under 5 feet tall, but in this context of this particular theater project at a school, at a college, I could actually do things. So, and I started my acting career being a ribbon dancer behind a scrim. It was for David Henry Wong had adapted, I think it was a Kawabata short story, a Japanese writer's short story, House of the Sleeping Beauties. So, so I danced with a ribbon. But then,
I love that.
But then I think it was my senior year or my junior year of college. It must have been my junior years. I actually got a lead in a play written by Momoko Iko, who became actually a friend later in life. And she had written a play called Gold Watch. And so, in other words, surprisingly, at a school like Stanford, there was somewhat of a creative community. We had a lot of musicians as well who became professional performers after they left the campus. And so I think it did plant a seed that, and I wrote some short stories. That was a time where we were just starting to do things like at coffee houses. So unfortunately, it wasn't a time where we did a lot of videotaping. I think somebody has a clunky, I think it's pre-VHS, a tape of me actually reading a short story. But I think, maybe I didn't think I could write a book that would be published, but there was definitely, I can write a story, and maybe it doesn't have to be, a story about these people in the South that I don't know, but actually something that's a little bit closer to home.
Yeah. I mean, that's such an interesting transition to almost give yourself permission to write a story that resonates more with you than with these characters who we stereotype in so many ways. Right?
Well, I don't think I thought it was really possible when I was young. I mean, it's so different today with so many diverse stories for children. I mean, we didn't have it, I think we're of the same generation, Julie. And there was like the 6 Chinese brothers. There was Ping, the like Chinese duck. There was a few. There were a few short books, written from, but it was more like from a Japanese perspective, not so much a Japanese American one. So I just didn't think it was really possible. But certainly, I think in the 80s, during the time I was going to college, they were having commission hearings for Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated. So I think there was this wrestling of what had happened to Japanese Americans during World War II. So I think all of these things kind of coalesced for me, and certainly kind of maybe I didn't see the door wide open, but I saw a crack, or at least necessity for this particular story to be told.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. And I think let's just spend a second on talking about this. In the 80s, I mean, I remember this as well, but we started to talk about and reckon with the fact that there were internment camps in this country during World War II, which was 40 years prior. Of course, now the 80s are 40 years later than that. But it took that long, and it's still not a history that we talk about or that we recognize as much because of how we want to position ourselves and think about ourselves as a country. I think we're in a reckoning now where we're coming to terms with a lot of things. But how did that particular time, because you wrote a whole series, or you've written Clark and Divisions about that time. I mean, how did you feel about that, it cracking open, but also having conversations that involve, people with Japanese American heritage and something to resonate?
Well, to be honest, it's kind of interesting. I'm a kind of outsider to this experience because, if someone were to look at me, they would think, oh, she's an insider to this community. But I was a little on the outside because my parents were in Hiroshima at the time of World War II. I mean, they're dealing with their own kind of hellish situation.
Yeah.
But my father was he was born here, but happened to be taken to Hiroshima and then returned back after World War II. So we have relatives on his side of the family who were in the camps. And so it was kind of on the periphery of my own personal history. But I think, going and we had, Nisei means second generation Japanese American. My parents had a lot of Nisei friends. So I was it was kind of floating up there. I kind of was aware of it when I was, up to high school. But I think in college, that's when, I took a civil liberties class in the law department. And I think then it was an awakening for me, and I think sometimes people say, well, if you're a certain ethnicity, you're going to know everything about that ethnicity. And that's not true. There has to be, for all people, I think, a decision that you want to dive deeper into that. And you have to be intentional about reading. I am a history nerd. So, for me personally, I just like diving deep and reading about these surprises, because I think if you don't know of what happened in the past and these kind of hidden histories, then you make a lot of assumptions. I think through history, there's so many amazing people, there's so many amazing writers that have passed on that really forged the way. And I get inspiration from hearing about those particular stories. But and then I think what was probably the most seminal was after I spent time in Japan for a year, I returned back and started working at the Rafu Shimpo. Rafu is the old name for Los Angeles, and Shimpo means newspaper. It was started in 1903, and believe it or not, it's still in business.
Wow.
It's like a miracle because so many mainstream newspapers have, gone away or gone totally digital. And this still have some, print copies that are given out to subscribers. So, that's when, so I worked there in the 80s. I left and then became editor in the 90s. So again, this redress and reparations movement was coming through. And there was a lot of talk of, how do people get payment? There was a lot of discussion. So in that way, I kind of entered into the story and interviewed so many people. So that's how, so it wasn't like this, I just knew about this history magically. It was actually had spent many years digging and documenting.
Yeah. I think for all of us, it's worth, even if you think to actually explore history because, we get told stories by our relatives and then you look at the history and you realize, that maybe you didn't understand the whole story or context or the rest of it. So you started in journalism and you said that you wanted to be a lawyer for a period of time. Those are different kinds of writing. and a different training. When you wanted to go into fiction, did you have to make a flip? And also, why crime fiction? Was it always crime fiction, or were you exploring other genres as well?
Well, I did the journalism because I needed to make money. That
Yeah.
was my first, because it's not like, oh, I want to be a novelist, I'm going to make money. So all those years I worked at the Rafu Shimpo, I would drive, and in LA, driving from one point to another takes a lot of effort. And
Yes.
I went to UCLA Extension and I took novel writing classes. So I didn't really intend on my first novel, Mas Arai novel, Summer of the Big Bachi, took 15 years before it was published. And so I had started it while I was working as a reporter. My heart of hearts was to write a book. That's really what I wanted to do. And I struggled, and it didn't really turn into a mystery until probably the last, 3 to 5 years that I was working on it. I even went to a writing workshop. I mean, I left my job. I was so devoted to this book that I took a fellowship in, of all places, Wichita, Kansas, to work on it. And even after that, it wasn't quite ready. It wasn't a mystery at that time either. And then it kind of, the book was told in two people's voices. And one was of this elderly gardener. And my writing mentor was telling me, Naomi, actually this Mas Arai character the voice is so much stronger than the other character, which was a doctor from Japan. And so I had to, this is after I spent like 10 years and was in Kansas. So I had to remove the other character and just go solely with Mas. And actually, it was my grandmother who had gifted me with a story because Mas was an atomic bomb survivor. I was motivated by my own family's history, and especially for my father, because he was an American who happened to be in Japan. And I thought an American atomic bomb survivor, in some ways I could remove all the politics and kind of just look into this human experience. And my grandmother, she survived the bomb, and she saw, this is kind of gross, but morbid, but this is crime, right? But she saw a dead body, a cadaver. It was decomposing, but you had to wear like a name tag at that time because they knew that Hiroshima was close to a naval base and something might happen. So she drew a picture. We don't have iPhones, right? And she, submitted it to NHK because they were collecting all these drawings of, from survivors. And the family, the family that was related to that person who had died was able to identify, that was, they didn't know what had happened to him. So for some reason, what my grandma did, and, it's kind of like a crime photo. It just stayed in my mind. And I go, I need to work this into a book. And then it kind of morphed into this mystery. I loved mysteries. I love British mysteries. But I also, while I was working on this, who was coming up was like people like Walter Mosley. I was unaware of Chester Himes. And so I came to him later and then started reading him. And then when I started seeing these African-American detective novelists, I go, oh, they're doing something that I kind of want to do. It's not only the mystery itself, but they're creating this like social milieu. They're showing like racial injustice. And so, it kind of opened my eyes. I've kind of felt like these people were walking beside me. I wasn't, so it was helpful to kind of feel them, knocking elbows. It's like, okay, this is a possibility. So that's when, it became a mystery. And I will say, when that happened, it became much easier for me to find an agent. I mean, it's still a struggle, but after I got representation, actually the selling of the book went pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Well, 15 years is a long time. Sounds like a long time, but learning how to write a novel is a journey, and frequently people will put that first novel or it ends up in a drawer or, but was that the novel that you sold?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow.
And I mean,
Wow.
I had rewritten the beginning like 33 times probably, and the whole book several times. The title itself had gone through a lot of incarnations. But yeah, I think it's very individual. Like for some people, like probably for most people, they should put that first book aside and work on something else. But I think for me, I was very motivated. This was a very personal story.
Uh-huh.
And it's from a 60, something point of view. And I attempted to write it when in my 20s. So it was very ambitious in that way. So I probably had to personally grow, to tell that particular story. But yeah, I think for some people who feel like they have to tell a certain story, like they have to do that before they die, maybe it is, I don't want anything I say to be necessarily prescriptive, because I think we all have to find our path. But for me, it was like sticking to Mas Arai, and at that right now, it's kind of cool to have older characters, but
right.
Back then, and also to write from a male point. I mean, it's, I think people are looking more for, since I'm a woman, female point of view, young, that would have been a better selling point at that time.
Yeah, well, you didn't make it easy on yourself, but you told the story that was in your heart. So, that's a wonderful thing to encourage people with. But do you, what's your process like, Naomi? When you're writing, it's probably different now than it was then. I'm wondering also if your theater background helped you with structure and story arcs and understanding how to shape a story, and gave you and also your journalism background gave you some, a little bit of a head start on what this is. It's different, but it's, the dramatic structure is dramatic structure.
I think actually with the acting, it was more about putting myself out there. And that's probably been helpful for me today, in just because so much of what we do is like doing podcasts and doing dramatic readings or whatever. And I think it's helped. And also just getting used to be on the stage, because I'm sure for many writers, you're just at your computer. So I think that was good for that purpose. I think journalism was good for me, just in interviewing so many people. And, back then we didn't have transcribing program, we're transcribing ourselves, and just listening to the cadence of how people speak. I think if people have problems with dialogue, they should really try to transcribe, certain interviews, or try to, if, get permission from people. If you're doing, you're doing a story set in the South, or with people with a particular, speaking pattern, get permission maybe to interview some people. I mean, it's so easy with Zoom, and then transcribe it and kind of understand like the way. I think knowing another language has helped me, because you kind of see the structure of how people speak. I think that's been helpful. In terms of my writing process, it did help that first that I'm pretty self-disciplined. Just the fact that, as a little kid, I'm like spending part of my summer writing, that's kind of weird. And I think with journalism, just that deadline, so helpful.
Yeah.
I have a lot of friends who are former journalists who are novelists now. So I think the advantages of having that training is you're meeting all sorts of people. You're interviewing, I talk to unhoused people. I talk to dissidents, political dissidents, the whole gamut. So that was very helpful, just in terms of learning character. And I think the discipline, I can't wait for the muse to hit me. I mean, I'm not so much wedded to, I need this space. I need this music or no music to write. I think being a journalist, especially during that time, is I have to write under any kind of conditions. Sometimes I would have to go to like a court, proceeding, and then over the phone, like report my story. So, I think that's good. That was very good for me to kind of break any requirements that I had to write. The bad side or the disadvantages of that kind of journalistic training, especially back then, there was at least this. We were supposed to be objective, and that could be argued, is anyone really objective? But that was what we strove for. So I think sometimes, well, at least for me, to kind of enter into one person's point of view, to be very subjective, that was more of a challenge when it came to writing the book from a particular person's point of view. Today, what my process is, and I think the pandemic was very difficult. It was difficult for me just because I'm a pretty sensitive person. I couldn't compartmentalize what was happening outside of my walls, So Clark and Division was due during the pandemic. I had written part of it beforehand, which was good. But once it came, the pandemic came, I knew I could not write my regular, word requirement, so I was kind of kind to myself because there was, no way out of it. But, the sprints, I think I will say, Sisters in Crime during the pandemic especially was very helpful. And all those programs, online programs you had, and people spoke about the Pomodoro method. So actually I've been meeting with another, she's a friend, but she's also a member of Sisters in Crime, Sarah Chen. 5 days a week, we've been meeting like from 8 to 9 o'clock in the morning Pacific time and doing 2 sprints.
That's great.
And I think I just needed that push. It's just like getting into the water. Sometimes it's kind of cold and you don't want to get in the water, but to just jump in the morning, and then to know after 1 hour, maybe I don't write thousands of words. Some people do in an hour. Maybe I'll have 500 words, So it's just like a release, like, I have 500. So for me to, at least I have that. And for me to go on, I could build on that. That's much easier than not have written anything. And then it's about 11 o'clock and it's like, I have to write something. It's just a whole different approach. So that's helped me. And we've continued that. And and it's nice in this time where we don't have as much social interaction to have at least one person, we do it through Twitter, believe it or not, Twitter DMs, and just check in with each other, how was your weekend? How was that, so just to have those like water cooler talks that way, just in a few minutes, has been helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. Writing is solitary, but it's not. You also need community and to have other writers who know what you're going through. Clark and Division is a historical. which I'm always amazed by people who write historical novels because it's so much work to pull that off. And during a pandemic, you couldn't even go to Chicago and visit, if that's part of your process. So talk to me about the difference and what drove you to take on this big project of writing this historical.
Now that I think of it in hindsight, I mean, it makes perfect sense that I would write a book like this because I've written actually a lot of nonfiction books on, related to this topic. And as well as I really like the voice of a young woman, in her 20s. And I've done some traditional novels. There's a Bicycle Cop one, there's a one set in Hawaii, and those two characters are 20 somethings. And I think the reason why, I gravitate toward either older or younger, I've said this before because I think those groups of people are often underestimated. But I think for I grew so much in my 20s, I shared some of my story just right now of going to a foreign country, Japan, and thinking you're going to be a lawyer and then deciding you're not going to do that. You're going to pursue writing, but how am I going to make money? And I think all those kind of decisions I made in that particular decade really set the foundation for who I am today. It's different for every person, but I think that's why I kind of love that particular decade of the 20s. And so in Clark and Division, it's history, but it's from a young woman's perspective, which is really fun for me and makes total sense. And so, I think I approach historicals a little differently than maybe the kind of established like women's historical fiction. I mean, I don't first of all, it was really important for me to write this in first person. And the reason why is I just wanted to, I thought this is something I could bring to this particular story, a little more intimacy. And since, I am Japanese American, although I had not been experienced that, but I had spent all this time talking to people. So I felt pretty confident that I could enter into that mind, although it took time. And my editor, Juliet Grams, had to really work with me to, so again, it wasn't instantaneous. So I think the first person POV, I feel can bring a little bit of freshness actually to the historical, a new. So I'm not that concerned. Like I don't spend a lot of time like describing a button or, I'm not good at a lot of physical description. So to me, it's like more to get into the mind of this character in the 40s and how she feels about certain things. So that's what I kind of leaned into. And that's what I would tell writers. I don't think, we can't be good at everything, so just figure out what's easy for you to, it may be physical description. So that world building is something you want to gravitate towards. But for me, it's more like the emotion. So that's something I feel like in all of my books, I want to grab hold of.
I find it fascinating that when you were in your 20s, you wrote a male character in his 60s. And now that you're older, you're writing a female character in her 20s. I just make that observation. I agree with you about your 20s. It's a huge time of growth and change, and it's a fascinating time to write characters because they're very present in their time. And 1944 is quite a time to be a 20-something woman, going through an experience like she went through.
I had problems getting into my female voice. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think I self-censored myself you know, I think at that particular time, and maybe that's why it took me so long to even, finish a novel or get into shape to be published, because I think there's certain vulnerabilities. I think we could have emotional blocks, and that's something I do talk about in some writing workshops, even related to Clark and Division, because I think we forget that, we just say, oh, just imagine, and imagination is limitless. But on the other hand, we are human, and the way we've been raised, the way we deal with adversity is very unique. And sometimes those kind of practices or quirks in our personalities or experiences could maybe blind us about certain things. And I think for me, being a kid of people, an immigrant mother, and kind of serving as a parent, like for her in a weird way, not financially, but I think those, I couldn't let my guard down, about certain things. And I think for each of us, it's worth kind of looking at those kind of things, because we may think in our books, because I think every reader wants some level of vulnerability. I don't care how, action-packed, a book is, people still want a certain level of vulnerability or emotional truth. It is important for us as writers to kind of, take those walks or do a retreat, not only to get words on paper, but kind of to do some kind of deep thinking, and often it's people in our lives that kind of hint, like, why are you like this? Why are you doing this? And we kind of push it aside. But maybe that's something we need to look at to infuse our books, with a certain, level of honesty that readers will be attracted to, because they're like, they know that they also have those failings, but they don't really want to look at it. But if it's, especially in a novel, it's easy, so they feel emotionally connected, but they don't have to reveal too much of themselves. They could just say, oh, this was a really good book.
Well, I agree with everything you said. I also, I just want to honor that you are willing to mine some family trauma. And when you're talking about Hiroshima, that's not a historical fact. That's something their family dealt with. And that's not a one-time event. That's a lifelong trauma that everyone deals with. And so, you've got to take care of yourself while you're doing this work as well.
For sure. And, I think that's a gift, from our younger people, who talk about self-care, like for a woman who, grew up in the 70s, you don't really think about that. That was not part of our vocabulary. I think for me, definitely, friendships have been very helpful. I've gone through therapy myself, so, for other purposes. So that was helpful. I think, yeah. And one, superpower I think my parents have is, they're both we lost my father about 10 years ago, but just a zest for life and a curiosity and a sense of fun and humor. So I think that's the kind of things I lean on. I find a lot of things absurd, and when I was young, my sport is actually basketball. Believe it or not, I played in high school even. So just the absurdity of this under 5 feet woman playing basketball, it's like S.J. Roseanne, right? I think it's like, this is crazy, and I think there's a lot of things. I'm not afraid to try anything, and I think that's helped to sustain me, and also to talk to people like, I'm not feeling well. How can, I love exercise. And I think also what's helped me is to always incorporate physical activity in my daily routine. And I was telling friends, I can't go to the gym right now because of COVID. I was really, going stir crazy. And they were going, oh, why don't you go to the Rose Bowl Aquatic Center? They have so I'm doing like old lady deep water aerobics, and it's actually not just for old ladies, but and it's absolutely fabulous. It's outdoors. Yeah. I live in LA, and it's just such a joy because everyone's, head is just bobbing up and down the water and everyone has a big smile on their face. So, I'm glad I didn't let oh, that's not cool. I don't want to do anything that's not cool, but just to be just open, and I think that's certainly helped me.
Yeah. Do you find that as you get older, you are less concerned with what's cool, or have you always been like, I'm just going to do what I want to do?
I'm pretty much, I'm just going to do what I want to do. I think
that's great.
That's just, that's helped me, I think, over the years.
So we talked about your writing journey, and you've published many books. Let's talk about the publishing journey a little bit. What surprised you about your publishing journey?
I certainly, when I started it, I didn't think that it would take me 15 years. And it was, I think, so when I was starting to write, like Amy Tan, had been such a success with Joy Luck Club. So I was thinking, oh, I need to find her agent, and approach her. So I wasn't really thinking, well, what kind of things does she write about? And especially when it morphed into a mystery, does it make sense? And during that, when you queried in the 80s and 90s, I have it on a board somewhere because I used to do this, all my rejection letters. And I think they would have these form postcards, and then there would be a blank line, and then they just write your name in there. So that's how the rejections came, and with no. So it was, so I had, queried like Amy Tan's agent and gotten one of those, postcards or form letters. And then I began to see this is like the wrong way to kind of look at myself as a writer. And especially when it morphed into a mystery, it's like one writer that I really loved was Barbara Neely, who wrote about a Black maid actually in the South who solved crimes. And, she was the underclass, and Barbara was doing a lot of different, there was a, element of humor in there. Not that I'm that humorous, but there is a sense of play in some of my books. So especially the Mas Arai ones. So I found out who her agent was, through reading the acknowledgments, and we didn't have Publishers Marketplace or anything like that back then. And then, set my manuscript in. It took time. A junior agent requested a full, but it took like 2 months, and back then we didn't do simultaneous, submissions. So I just didn't think it would take so long. And of course, just like all other writers, because Summer of the Big Bocce was picked up by Random House, Bantam, but it was a paperback original. And I didn't know. I was not sophisticated. So I was like, what does that mean? And so it turned out that format was like the best format for me. I was writing idiosyncratic stories. So it would take some time to find the readership. But Julie, I've basically been a paperback writer, until Clark and Division. I mean, some books were also published in hardcover for libraries, but I didn't really, I don't consider them as straight hardcover releases. Yeah. So it's taken me, like 18 years or something, 17 years of being a paper, my husband always would be singing paperback writer. You would tease me. I go, yep, I'm a paperback writer. And finally, I have a hardcover release. So it's taken a long time.
Yeah. A hardcover release that was going to be a standalone was the original plan, but now you just finished the second book. Is that true?
That is true. It's not a series. I'm not going to keep writing from the second book is a sequel, and my from the same protagonist point of view. Some things, I'd be perfectly frank with you, is like calculated business. Just because series, it's an easier sell, and I'm talking about readers,
Yeah.
So they, and this is another thing, to do a standalone gets more, but ironically, a standalone gets more interest. Like from the press, from reviewers.
Right.
So, we didn't know, I only had a 1-book contract. So, of course they said Clark and Division was a standalone. But I think in the back of people's minds, they said, well, if this is doing well, we're going to put another book out. Okay. So, but I knew that I didn't want to keep writing, books from Aki Ito. I felt her story could be contained in like 2 books. The second book takes place in Los Angeles in 1946. So that particular story of kind of the resettlement of Japanese Americans back to the West Coast is compelling. And I think it's worth another book. But we are branding. Okay, this is now pure business. We're kind of branding a series, but there's going to be other books from different characters' points of view. So not quite exciting. A Tana French, not quite what she does, but kind of.
Yeah, that's exciting. That's really exciting. Are you excited about that?
I'm super excited. I have like at least 2 other solid books I'm thinking outside of this next one that's coming out. But then I'm kind of worried, like, what's going to happen? I'm a planner. I will say this again, from a writer business point of view. I do journal. I have a writing journal, like I'm a book journal in which I journal. I think about, okay, what are my projects for the next 2 years? In the past, I've even done it for like 10 years, and things change. But the good thing about that is, like, for Clark and Division, I knew I wanted to write the Chicago book. So even though I was working on other projects, I made time to go to Chicago in 2016. I went in 2018 as well. So that was pre-pandemic. So, I wished I could go again during the pandemic, but at least I had 2 solid research trips. Yeah. So I'm spinning a lot of plates at one time, but it's not that confusing because I've been journaling or thinking about what books I would like to work on, even without a contract, like which ones I want to pitch. Yeah.
That's wonderful advice for people to dream, right? To and write it down, make it more tangible than just a thought in your head.
Yeah, and it's not even dreaming; it's like planning, because you have to do work. I mean, if you're doing a historical, or even if you're not doing a historical, like in my contemporary mysteries, there's still things I needed to research, right?
Yep.
To incorporate.
Yeah. No, it's great. Well, and Clark and Division's been a big book for you, and it's very exciting and to see, it getting so many awards and acclaim and everything else. It's huge congratulations, but again, success isn't overnight for anybody. So, yeah.
Yeah, I thought actually I was going to retire because being a paperback writer, I mean, I have to work on multiple projects at one time, and it gets exhausting, and
yeah.
I think pre-pandemic, just the marketing, because I'm very cognizant. I don't want to spend all this money traveling on my own dime and then be left with nothing. So, but it involves sleeping on a lot of couches and, doing those kind of things. And it was like, oh, I think I'm too old to be doing this. So, I mean, that was something I was aware of as well.
Well, one good thing that came out of the pandemic is things like Zoom, like and now virtual events, I think are going to exist outside the pandemic, which I think opens up a lot of opportunities for people to have conversations from different places and to participate.
For sure. I totally agree.
Yeah. Well, so are you working like a book a year now? I mean, will this Clark and Division series, I don't know what you're calling what the brand of the series is, but are these a book a year projects or a book every 18 months, or is this your primary focus right now?
I'm hoping that it will be a book a year. And I think my publisher hopes that it will be a book a year. But another thing I've kind of started to do is doing nonfiction like children's books that kind of came out of the pandemic. One of my former agents is now an editor at Running Press, which is a Hachette kind of imprint. So she asked me to do something in the pandemic, and it was kind of crazy, but I did it. And now that's opened up another opportunity. So I'm kind of also, I kind of like having my foot a little bit in like two places, just because it's hard. I understand publishers because I also have, being an editor, I kind of understand a publisher's point of view. They have so many different writers, it's not just me, so they're going to have to divide their attention, over a lot of different people. And so as a result, for me as a writer, I kind of like to have at least one kind of side gig so that, so that I don't pin all my attention. Oh, why hasn't my publisher contacted? Why hasn't my editor contacted me? It's like, well, I have another project I have to focus on. So I think for my mental health, that's kind of helpful. And just exercising, a different part of my brain is good. And I will have to say, I really enjoy working with illustrators. So that's been really fun. But yeah, in terms of mysteries, I have decided to focus my energies, with historical mysteries, and I gladly do it. I'm kind of, so that's where I'm at right now.
That's great. It's exciting for your readers to hear that, for sure. Naomi, thank you so much for a great conversation, and a generous conversation, because the writing and the business are two different sides of what we do, and it's important for people to hear about both.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being with us today. Sisters in Crime is about community. We were founded to advocate for women crime writers, and we continue that mission by fighting for equity in the crime writing community. Sisters in Crime is an international, inclusive organization for all who write and love crime fiction, mystery, thrillers, and suspense. Join us at sistersInCrime.org and make sure you subscribe to this podcast.